I am so excited to get started. I have with me today two absolutely incredible leaders. Their extended bios are on our website, and if I were to read them, we wouldn't have time for any further conversation because they are both so accomplished. So I will be brief so we can jump in. First, Brian Lally, Senior Vice President and Chief Development Officer at Northwell Health. I met Brian via telephone for the first time when Northwell announced a $1 billion campaign, which was kind of unheard of in healthcare at the time. And when I called and commended Brian for such an incredibly lofty goal, he was typically self-effacing and said that his hope was that healthcare organizations would all set their goals at this kind of a level, like those in higher education, and think about endowing chairs and endowing other parts of their organizations in order to ensure that we are able to deliver on our missions to our community's health. And then Michael Dowling, President and Chief Executive Officer, Northwell Health. As many of you may have noticed, Michael was awarded the #2 spot on Modern Healthcare's list of most influential this year. But what I loved about that is that the #1 spot went to the frontline healthcare worker. And after seeing Michael speak in the past and reading his most recent book, my guess is that you would happily give that #1 spot up every year to that group. Michael, I want to start with you. Northwell was on the front lines of the COVID crisis last spring. At the peak, you had 3,500 COVID positive patients in your system at one time. And if I'm remembering right, over 50,000 or so through the Northwell system by July when the book went to print. So what were the most important lessons that you learned throughout the early days of the pandemic?
Well, thank you, Alice. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you. And just on the numbers, we've actually taken and treated about 190,000 COVID patients since the beginning. But the important lessons, there are many. I'll just mention them very, very briefly. One lesson is the importance of healthcare as a defender of public health in the community. This became unbelievably obvious because as every other business got massively disrupted, healthcare, which was disrupted in a different way, stayed on as the defender in providing healthcare to the community. And that's an important message philanthropically. And I think people realize that. We were there when everybody else was in many ways finding a solace in different places. The other couple of quick lessons was the importance of the frontline worker, which you just mentioned, the dedication and the compassion and the courage that they demonstrated was absolutely extraordinary. And I'm sure everybody realized that is involved in healthcare. The importance of health systems overall, having a large integrated system made it unbelievably important and relevant to dealing with the issue because we were able to move patients between facilities, which you would not have been able to do if you were not a large integrated system. Having a disaster preparedness, emergency management infrastructure in place was absolutely key. Another lesson, of course, was that during a crisis, innovation and creativity blossoms because you do things in a crisis that under normal circumstances you deliberate on, you analyze, you do business plans, you do all of that kind of stuff, and then you analyze yourself out of action. Whereas in a crisis, you've got to act and they all work. And then the other, of course, unbelievable lesson that we have to deal with going forward now are the inequities in healthcare, the disproportionate effect on certain populations, certain communities, that now becomes a long-term priority for us, more so than ever before. And those would be some basic lessons. One other one is that it has changed every single one of us. We're all different now. And I think if we look at it correctly and appropriately, we will be better for it as organizations and as individuals because it demonstrated our fragility, but it also demonstrated our strength of what you can do in a very difficult time. And it was a humbling experience, but an experience that if we learn from it, we will all be able to do better going forward. So just a couple of quick lessons.
I think you rightly point to this sort of overwhelming moment of generosity. And Brian, I know you were in the midst of this $1 billion campaign and you had plans for what you were going to be talking to donors about, and then COVID hit. So how did you pivot and what did you see in terms of how donors stepped forward, especially in the early days of the work that you were doing?
Well, I'm on the call with my boss, so at the risk of sounding obsequious, let me just say that first off, Michael's stance set the tone. The Northwell culture came through right from the very beginning. We learned right out of the gate there's no backing down, and that we need to take problems head on. And Michael talked about the team. Everybody felt connected. We all were in with our frontline caregivers, no matter where we were. We felt all connected to this one. The organization was really quite prepared. Everybody, non-frontline people, everybody had a laptop in their hands 2 years before. We were ready to work from home if needed. Think about a snowstorm, but we were ready. And so when this hit, and nobody expected it to be like this, of course, but we were working seamlessly right from the very beginning, communicated constantly. And again, going back to the approach that Michael set for the organization, we made a decision. In retrospect, it was seems brilliant, but at the time it was iffy. But right out of the gate, we're going to take an aggressive position, and our entire program moved into COVID support, all of it, the whole campaign. So direct mail, events, major everything went into COVID support for the frontline teams. It was the way to go. Risky at the time, but it was absolutely the way to go, and it's completely aligned with what Northwell was doing. So, at the end of the day, that turned out to be a positive outcome in a lot of ways. But it gets easier. It gets easier when the CEO is spending time in the ICU. It gets a lot easier for the rest of us just to lock in, arm in arm on this stuff.
One of the things that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Michael.
It's very important to look at this and put it in proper perspective. When you're in healthcare, you deal with crisis on a daily basis. Yeah. This was a big one. And so your true character comes out when you deal in a crisis. So things happen to you, and it's how you react to them that defines you. And healthcare, I think, reacted to this pretty well. And there cannot be, I mentioned this numerous times, and even in the media, where you don't put up the white flag, you don't retreat, you go straight forward, and you start with the attitude that you're going to beat this thing. This thing is not going to beat you. Even if it lasts a year, 2 years, at the end of the day, we will win. That positive attitude resonates through staff and builds that sense of optimism that Brian was alluding to, that you absolutely need to be able to succeed in situations like this. And that goes for philanthropy as well.
Yeah, one of the things that you said at the conference that I saw you at a couple of years ago was that you met with every single staff member in their first week or two. And I assume now maybe not as much in person, but that you did, and that you probably still do. And I can only imagine that connection helps with this kind of a situation. What can philanthropy do? What can donors do to support frontline workers as we hopefully begin to come out of this, and it's time for them to get to take a breath? How do we show support differently perhaps than we have in the past year?
Well, first of all, I do meet all new employees. I still do it.
For you.
We hire about 150 to 200 people a week, so I do meet all of them. And pre-COVID, I used to spend about 2 to 2.5 hours with them every Monday morning. And it's an important message, because what you want to build in an organization is a culture, and also among your board and your donors is to build a culture of commitment and dedication, and making sure that they understand what frontline workers went through each and every day. And and Brian did a wonderful job of explaining that to donors, providing them with examples of what was going on each and every day. Because remember, a lot of the donors, and including a lot of board members, they disappeared geographically and they went to their safe home someplace, but they had to be connected so that they understood what went on a daily basis. Because the work during COVID didn't happen in the C-suite. It happened on the factory floor, on the units, on the hospital floors. And as I said, Brian did a very good job of connecting the donors to that mission-oriented work. And one of the things I find in meeting with donors myself is that they're interested in the business, but they're interested even more so, many of them, in the mission. The fact that you care about everybody, irrespective of circumstance, you treat everybody fairly, you do it the right way, and you do it for the right reason. And if that message comes across, you build some loyalty among your donor base.
Yeah.
And Alice, just to give you some of the numbers that support what Michael said, because the communities across our entire footprint were really with us. They were with us all the way. I mean, they fed us, and we counted over 350,000 meals, and I guarantee that's a third of what actually came in. I think Northwell, the community supporting Northwell, is what kept the New York pizza business going. And 7 o'clock in New York City was a very noisy place in the height of all this, because people were reaching out their windows and clapping and beating pots and pans. They just wanted to say they were with us through this. The community wanted to engage with us. And by the time the dust has settled, and quite frankly, it hasn't fully settled yet, but by the time dust settled, we saw over $36 million come into our organization from over 18,000 donors, and over 1 million pieces of medical supplies and PPE, et cetera. So it really was a connection between the community and the community writ large and the healthcare community. It was a very powerful thing for us to be part of.
And I just want to add that we got about, and the number is great, but probably greater than this number because it has been continued to expand, but we had about 1,200 businesses and companies provide supplies, meals, and other things to us. I actually hand wrote a response to everyone. I don't believe in doing the stamp.
Good for you.
I brought into my office all these letters, and the staff said to me, you're not going to sign all of these, are you? I said, yes, because if somebody takes the time to do something for you, you take the time to respond accordingly. And if you get a stamp letter, which I hate, quite honestly, it means, and if I get them, I know that the person who sent it never saw the letter. Yeah. But if your original signature is on it and you make a note on it, they know that you cared about what they did. And that is an important message. Take the time to do it right.
We're going to ask you to come teach the fundamentals class at our Madison Institute, which is a week-long event. And one of the first things we talk about to, very early stage fundraisers is exactly what you're talking about. Be authentic, use a handwritten note, write your signature. It's really powerful that you did that, and an enormous message to the philanthropy team, in addition to all of those donors, that you took the time to do that.
Well, I like to do things in person, in part because I'm not good at the computers. I write everything hand, and I meet with people on an ongoing basis. That's why I do the meetings with employees. And back to the employee issue, during COVID, despite all of the stress and everything else, our employee engagement jumped to the 91st percentile. The largest jump in employee engagement that we've ever seen happened during COVID.
Good for you.
And we also provided to the employees, every person that took care of patients, we spent $140 million providing a bonus to each one of $2,500 plus to each employee 1 week paid time off.
Shows remarkable commitment to these extremely important people.
And as you know, all of our employees are also our ambassadors with donors. Whether the donors be the local people in the community or the large scale donors that, Brian often spends an awful lot of time on.
Yeah, excellent. If you sort of pivot to thinking about kind of this next phase that we're in, so we're moving toward a more normal universe. How are you thinking about your 2021 efforts on philanthropy with donors and in terms of the work of Northwell? I mean, there was a report today that said that 40% of hospitals across this country are still going to be in the red this year. AHA had another number out there that was sort of $40 billion. What is 2021 going to bring, and how do we collectively sort of try to bring ourselves out of some of the issues that we've had in the last year?
Well, let me begin. I'll turn it over to Brian. On the financial side of it, for us as an organization, we will end up 21 in the black. We pivot very, very quickly. So even we're in the middle of a COVID, you're pivoting at the same time. So you just don't just do one thing and say, when that stops, and do something else. You can actually do both at the same time if you have the right team in place, which I believe most places will have. So I think the 21 will be an okay year for us. We lost about $1.5 billion in revenue, but of course the government came in and helped, and our business is almost back to where it was pre-COVID. except for the emergency department, and that's not a bad thing. So, and our board and the donors that we talk with are unbelievably positive about how we reacted to all of this because we took a lead position. We were more prepared than most because we have our own supply chain infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. We never had a problem with masks or supplies or anything like that because we had been working on that for years. Our emergency management infrastructure, we've been working on it since the year, 1 year prior to 9/11. We started building an infrastructure, including our own GPO, et cetera, et cetera. So as Brian mentioned earlier, we're a little bit better prepared. So I think 21 will be an okay year. And I believe that we will continue to get better. We will be better because we went through COVID. What we did in COVID, if we can do what we did in COVID, imagine what we can do when COVID doesn't exist. It's all a matter of optimism, raising the bar, dreaming high and dreaming big and going for it and taking risk and, not backing up. Brian, why don't you touch base on the donors?
Yeah, so, well, we launched this, we're in a campaign we launched publicly in 2018 with that aforementioned $1 billion goal. And we're north of 780 million at this point. Last year was incredibly challenged. I mean, we used the word, I've heard the word pivot a dozen times today. We must have used that word all the time because we had to pivot and adapt and adjust and et cetera. But, the outcome, the go forward. First off, Northwell's brand equity is through the roof and COVID is absolutely part of our story. And I think that, just reflecting on what Michael said, the power of this integrated academic health system, specifically this one, it was just spotlighted. It was so clear that, when you put together the whole organization in the way that we have, and then you put it all into one problem, what great things can come out of that. And so as we go forward, some of the things that have always been, top of consciousness for us, but challenging from a development perspective, we're going to start digging in. Those include health equity. Michael, for this organization, has taken a position on gun violence. We're going to look at mental health support for the public and for our team as well. And so, and all the traditional stuff as well. But as we move forward towards the back end of the campaign, we're going to try to move more actively and aggressively into what I call these system opportunities. And our COVID experience is affirming for us.
Ever so often, it's good to get kicked in the butt ever so often. It wakens you up. Yes. And, last year, we got knocked around a little bit. Every organization. Remember one other thing. Many businesses, every business was dramatically disrupted. It just wasn't healthcare. Yeah. But we were the mainstay for the community during that period of time. And, it was a difficult issue. But I think it strengthens you. You can take strength from getting hit ever so often in a way you didn't anticipate, because you dig deep down, and when you dig deep down, you find out that you're capable of an awful lot more than you ever thought you were.
Yeah. There are two themes that keep coming up. One is around health equity that I'd love to talk a little bit about, and the other is about innovation and creativity. And several places in your book you talk about sort of the remarkable innovation that can happen as a result of the quick reduction in regulation or in rules or in, even the timelines of things. We're not doing it that way. We're doing it this way because we're in a pandemic. And one of the things you talk a lot about is telehealth and the fact that telehealth, the reimbursement of telehealth as as a normal visit is an important part of why telehealth happened that fast. Are there things that you particularly hope we have learned we don't need, or regulations, or ways in which we can move faster in healthcare that we've learned through this?
Well, I think one is that organizations have to be willing to take risk, make mistakes, and ask for forgiveness later. Sometimes people ask for too much permission. Entrepreneurs always break the rules. They always push the edge of the envelope, because that's what entrepreneurship is. It's like research and discovery. You discover by challenging. So it's an attitude and part of your culture to be pushing forward all the time. And that, I think, is a leadership task for people leading these organizations. The other thing is that we have to put a lot of pressure on government to relax the stupid, the things that don't give you any benefit. And we lived in a world of micro-regulation and compliance. And they're the antithesis of innovation. So that becomes a lobbying issue for us. And we have to be very careful, because government, there will be a tendency of government now, and especially even in New York State and nationally, to have government take on more responsibility. So what they should take on responsibility for are those things that they legitimately need to do, but not micromanage what healthcare systems do on a day-to-day basis with the delivery of care, but allow for the flexibility. If that flexibility is allowed, there's no limit. Now, you're going to make mistakes. And, leadership is about accepting failure so you can learn from it.
Yeah.
If everything you do is always successful, you're not going anyplace, because you haven't failed. You've got to fail to succeed. And as Churchill once said, success is going from failure to failure without a loss of enthusiasm. And you just keep moving forward. So it's a cultural issue. Yeah. So I'm very optimistic about the next 5 years. I think leadership is about building the future and creating it, and be willing to make mistakes, and be willing to allow your people to make mistakes.
I'm going to ask both of you this one, and it's around health equity, but it's also around all of the other things that we've sort of talked about. I think it's very clear that healthcare can play an enormous role in health equity and trying to reduce the amount of negative social determinants of health that we see, in ensuring that people have equal access to care, that they're treated similarly. I know it's a big part of where you saw holes during the course of this process. Can you talk a little bit about where Northwell is committing? And then Brian, maybe could you talk a little bit about whether you're seeing donors who are interested in supporting that work?
Well, let me begin by saying that we've always been working on this, but as everybody has, but COVID demonstrated that we have a much bigger problem than we've ever acknowledged.
Yeah.
And we are doing an awful lot. Everybody's doing a lot in these communities at the moment with testing and vaccination. And we've got to be careful that we don't allow that to be the end result. We got to vaccinate everybody. We've got to reduce the vaccine hesitancy. But it's when COVID is over, is when we've got to maintain our commitment in those communities. So we've identified about 11 communities that we are going to be focused very deliberately on. But it involves working on employment, housing, education, gun violence, as well as healthcare delivery. You don't solve the problems in those areas only with the provision of the traditional medical care, like I'll open up an urgent care center, I'll open up an ambulatory site. You got to make help with working with others, building coalitions that you make it safe for people to move around that community. The loss of a job is ill health. Yep. If the best thing you can do for people is providing a job. The other thing we will be doing, one of the things we'll be doing, is providing a major scholarship program for poor kids in those communities so that they can access community college. You take a kid out of a family in those neighborhoods that don't have the opportunity and you allow them to go to college, it changes the whole family. Yep. So we've got to broaden what we define as health, not stay narrow, broaden it. And that's where we're going to be focused in a big way over the next, for as long as we'll be here doing this.
Excellent. And Brian, are you seeing donors who are supportive?
I think there's interest out there, like so many other things we have to explain. And, one of the things that's come out of this is our ability to actually explain it to people, to help people understand how an organization like Northwell, and I know this is a national story for a lot of the health systems, but how an organization like an integrated health system really can make a big difference. This idea, social determinants of health, upstreaming, et cetera. I mean, we've been talking about this in healthcare for decades. It's not like it's a new thought process, but we have an opportunity now to get moving on it in a way that I don't think we did before. And so, we follow on in terms of where leadership is directing. But as you all know, the development work really needs to be in front. Nothing that we're talking about here is funded. And, Northwell doesn't have unlimited funding. So obviously we're going to develop opportunities for starting with our board members, but we're going to look for opportunities to help people think big about helping us do something really special in this space.
The other thing here, one point here is that you've got to go into those communities and listen. You can't just go in and say, I know. Yep. You got to go in and listen. Yep. And I have one experience recently in a community. I work an awful lot with the local pastors and the clergy. And one pastor in one poor community basically said, when I was with him, I said, what is one of the biggest issues you've got? And he said, well, the central convening place in this community is the church. But the roof of the church is leaking. And I went to the church and you could see where it was leaking. I got the money to replace the roof in the church. Yeah. That makes a difference.
Yeah.
And so so my point is that you've got to broaden your perspective a little bit here about what's important, and don't go in thinking you know. Because if you do that, you'll prove that you don't know.
Yeah. There's been a lot of talk about partnerships too. And I think that's one way you can prove that you are listening, is to partner with people who've been working in these spaces as well. Are you looking at significant partnership?
Well, we look at everybody. We look at social agencies, business communities, the educational communities, etc. And it will vary by community and community, not every two things. There's the food insecurity. I think the food industry has a huge obligation here. We can't decide that we just know everything about health, because it depends on how we define health. Health is much broader than the way we define it, as I mentioned. So we got to convince other people that they've got to come in as partners in making this happen. And I think as a result of COVID, there is a much more of an understanding that need needs to be met. Yeah. And you go to the people that care the most and that are willing to help, and you start it incrementally. But you work with the community. The community will be very, very helpful to you when you go in. Not, as I said earlier, not pretending to know what it is exactly they want. But
I'm going to open it up for questions in just a minute, but here's the last one for you, Michael. Think, you've got your crystal ball in front of you, your vision of healthcare in 5 to 10 years. What are the changes that you hope we have made as a result of all of this? What does it look like? And then how does philanthropy help make that vision happen?
Well, I want to be known as a real health system, which means I want to be as good at prevention and wellness as I am in treating illness. And this gets, people talk about it in different ways. Brian mentioned it earlier. But we are essentially medical care delivery systems, and we've got to change our definitions to be on the upfront side of it as well as the downstream side of it. Yep. And I think if we keep focused on this and we become customer obsessed, that we're in the customer service business, and it's not what we matter that thinks, it's what the customer matters that thinks. And technology will be a huge part of this. We will be delivering a major portion of our healthcare with various forms of digital health in the next couple of years. And if you don't get there ahead, the consumer is going to push you in that direction anyway. But it opens up opportunities for enhanced access, enhanced service and convenience if we do it right. And we will be working remotely more. Yeah. I mean, these kinds of meetings remote. We ran the whole management of the COVID crisis for the whole year remotely, because after the first 3 days when we all got together, 2 of my senior leaders got sick with COVID and we had to disband. Yet we could manage it even though none of us are together the way we used to be before. Yeah. And so I think the opportunity for healthcare now is much, much greater. We have to watch, however, for government to be supportive and not be restrictive. If government becomes restrictive, then I think innovation will stifle. And that worries me big time.
Yeah. Brian, how does philanthropy help?
Philanthropy, if done well, is always at the front, right? And anytime you talk about the vision, certainly 5 years out, I guarantee that funding isn't there for it. So, helping people see that vision and be part of actually creating it, that's the sweet spot for development. That's where we all should be. So it is important to be thinking that. Michael always talks about, being 5 years out. We all have to think that way. And philanthropy, because, we got to connect into that and then create that story in order to push it forward. So it's absolutely critical to the growth of the organization. Excellent.
I think there are probably more than a few questions in the audience. If you will raise your hand, that little thing that you can click and put your camera on, John Wilson is going to help me out because I can't see everybody. And he's going to call on people. So John, can you give us our first question, please?
Thank you. And as Alice mentioned, if you have a question, please click the reactions button at the bottom and then click raise hand. And I see we have a question here from Connie Falcone. So Connie, I will unmute you and add your video.
Thank you, John. I think this is a really interesting opportunity, since we have the two of you here today, to share how you decide what strategic priorities you will fund. Does it come from the top down, from the CEO level, or are you taking recommendations from Brian and the philanthropy team?
Brian, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll take the lead on that. One of the interesting things about working at Northwell, you learn this in a leadership role early on, is you have to figure it out. Michael doesn't have a playbook, and it's constantly evolving. So, we have to stay in touch with where the organization is going. I know a lot of people in my seat in other organizations have the same kind of problems that I do. One of them includes things like, well, we were going to build that building and we changed our mind. So we really need to be really very, very flexible, but the guidance comes from the leadership. The development team, the integrated part is always, well, what can we fund? And that's where, the fungible dollars come in, et cetera. But the guidance has to come from the top. So it's critically important. One of the things that, Michael does, and I talked earlier about the culture here, but the leadership team, gets together on a regular basis, and it's not necessarily prescribed, it's more organic. But that really is a way to stay connected to where the organization's going.
Well, I said, I have a long list of things that we need to do, both ROI projects, things that you have to build to keep the business going. And then you have mission projects. Like I just came out of a meeting. Brian doesn't even know this yet.
Oh, here we go.
Here we go. See?
Here we go.
I just came out of a meeting where we believe we have to do something special to build a whole new facility for behavioral health for kids. A dire need. Now, if you look at the business aspects of that, it does require, obviously, funding. And so we will, over the next month or two, decide whether that's one of the biggest priorities or not, and we will. And then Brian and I will sit, and our team will sit, and we'll say, okay, this is something we have to get done because it helps the community. Now, if I meet a donor that says I have money to give away, I invariably know that there is something I need to do that will fit that money. So yes, we do have a list of high-end projects that comes on the top that we need to do, and Brian gets that list, but it evolves as time goes on, because the strategy is consistent, but the tactics differ, and they vary from time to time. But it's not overly prescriptive. If Brian comes to me and says, I have a donor wants to give me $100 million, and I know where to spend it. That's not the problem. I
don't usually do that, though. Just to be...
no, I put that out there. Just hopefully someday he will do that to me. He hasn't up to this point. I keep urging. That's how we work. You kind of, you light a fire inside people and not under them.
Thank you. Michael Dawson looks like he has a question.
Yeah, this question is directed towards Michael. One thing that really got my attention was your employee engagement scores went way up. Yeah. And I was wondering what you attributed that to, because, a lot of hospitals had drops in volumes. Some hospitals had to furlough employees. Some organizations had to eliminate certain service lines. There was a real stress on some of the hospitals. So through all this, how did your scores go way up?
Well, we provided a massive menu of services to employees all during the COVID. We did not lay off any employees. We actually used them all. We reassigned and redeployed all over the place. But I think there are two things that helped. We had from day one, we had absolutely adequate PPE. We were the first to require all employees or give them the opportunity to wear masks. We were using 150,000 masks a day. I never ran close. I was able to tell employees every day that we had all the supplies that they needed and didn't have to worry. That was huge, huge, because I was able to say that we could provide for their safety. The second thing we did is we provided housing for people that didn't want to go home at night. We provided daycare. We created tranquility tents. But the other thing that was extraordinarily helpful is that we communicated multiple times a day with all employees. Communication, communication, communication. I walked the floor of every ICU every day in all my facilities, and I got 23 hospitals. I was out every day. I went to every ICU. I was in every COVID unit. I met the staff, and so did my other leadership team. So we made sure that leadership, they understood that leadership was side by side with them. Extraordinarily important. And you cannot over communicate. And it wasn't just done with email, we did that too. It was done in person. That plus the ability to assure them that they were safe made a huge, huge difference. I would say those are the two big things. When I go out to them, and I still do this all the time, employees come up to you, they give you the high five, and they say, we have a statement around here. We say we're made for this. So employees will come up with signs and they'll have it on their shirt. We're made for this. This thing is not going to knock us down. We may get hit in the face, but we're going to smile and hit right back. And that's how I like to work anyway. You don't retreat from a fight. This was a fight. And you get people want, and one last point, I could go on this for a long time, but I know Alice will cut me off in a minute. People just don't want to work for an organization. People want to belong to a place with a mission. If you can get them to understand that we have a mission and this was a war, and if you make them feel like they belong, then you've got it.
Yeah, I'll add to that, Michael. It's the same thing. We all of us, and there's 75,000 of us, and I can speak for most of them, 91st percentiles, we all felt a sense of purpose. We all felt connected as one team fighting this thing together. The entire organization felt connected. And that's it. That's why it went up.
We're very integrated as an organization. We're highly, highly integrated. So, and it went up across the board, all across. It wasn't just one area, it went across the board. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got time, I think, for one more. Shake, you have the floor.
You're on mute, Shake.
Thank you so much. I think we got the mute twice. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been so wonderful to hear you, and your passion and your dedication to healthcare is palpable. I can only imagine what it feels like to work with you and on your team. You talked a little bit about— I
disagree with that, Brian. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
You talked a little bit about the organic connections that happen within your organization and the fact that you've managed through COVID remotely. Can you talk a little more about how you facilitate those organic connections remotely? I think many of us are trying to figure that out, and your prediction for 5 to 10 years is more remote work. How do you think we can do a better job of managing our organizations remotely? Thank you.
If I get the question, is it how can we do a better job of managing remotely? That's the question. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And keeping the connectedness, I think, right?
What I think we have to do is we're going to have to create a hybrid. So I don't believe you will have people who will do remote all the time. I don't think it's good for anybody. I think you're going to have part remote, part in person, 3 days at home, 2 days in the office, 4 days at home, 1 day in there, because you need the socialization. So I think it's finding that balance between remote and in person, and giving as much flexibility as you possibly can, and making sure that you retain the culture that you have, team-oriented, collaborative, etc., constant communication, and making people feel part of the team. I think that will absolutely be key. We have 10,000 people right now working remotely. And I think it will probably stay around that number, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But I want them to be remote, but obviously completely connected socialization-wise with the organization. And I've actually been out talking to many of the people who work remotely for us right now and have been. And by the way, productivity has gone up with people working remotely. But they do need to be able to get together, and you've got to facilitate that. And so don't go one way totally or the other way totally. And life is a balance between the left and the right all the time. And if you can stay down the middle, you're doing fine.
Thank you.
But I can't overemphasize communication, and in-person communication as much as possible.
I would love to keep you for another 2.5 hours at least, but I promised you I wouldn't do that to you. Thank you.
Find more work for me to do.
Well, you've got to go find that $100 million gift too. So
keep them around.
I want to thank you so much, both of you. It has been such a joy and such an honor to get to have this conversation. And I knew when it became a possibility that this was something that would be valuable to this group, but hearing the stories from you, hearing the dedication that you have toward the team, Michael, and the leadership, the way that you sort of think about leadership at Northwell, it's no surprise that you managed through really some of the darkest days of the pandemic in a way that that is just remarkable. So thank you. Yeah.
Let me say just one thing. You've got to love what you do and hire people who are going to love what they do. Because, and this is about building culture. If we hire 100, which we do, 150, 200 people a week, and I hire the wrong people, I end up with the wrong culture.
Yeah.
So hire people who believe in what we do, who care about what we do, who like what we do, and who are willing to commit their effort for the right reason.
Yeah.
If you can convince them and send that message continuously, you build a proper culture. Culture is what won and helped us with COVID. Structure was important, culture won.
So in the hope that perhaps one day we can do this in person and you can communicate in person with us, I will extend an invitation to you to some event that we do in the future as well now. And knowing me as you do, I will probably manage to hound you into doing it. But thank you so much for what you have done today.
Recorded down, Michael.
What's that?
This is being recorded. Be careful.
It is. It is. Did he say yes?
Yes, it's yes. Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. I mean, you know, we're all in this together. You know. So.
And knowing that we have people like you to help us in the fundraising world is incredibly important to all of us. So thank you.
The other reason, Alice, is that I want to go someplace sometime.
Well, I promise you, I will come up with somewhere good.
Even if it's Washington.
Hey now. Yeah. You're welcome here, but we can also come up with somewhere else.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. I appreciate it.